Outlast 2 is one of the most bizarre games I think I've ever played. It's a so-called horror game that can't ever really find any kind of rhythm with its gameplay, and it has a story that's muddled, confusing, and at times, utter schlock. Developed by Red Barrels, it's the sequel to the original Outlast they released in 2013, and if you were hoping it would improve the original game's formula, well, then you're going to be disappointed, as Outlast 2 has managed to bring along a whole lot of problems of its own. Now, I won't hide the fact that I disliked the first game quite a bit, but I did go into this one with an open mind. But even still, it took all of 30 minutes for the game to ultimately let me down. Outlast 2 is described as being a mature, intense psychological horror game. Feels like it's taken influence from other games like Resident Evil 5, The Forest, and The Evil Within, and films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But influence is about all it's taken, as it can't hold a candle to any of those in the slightest. This so-called mature story focuses around the protagonist Blake and his wife Lynn, who are heading to an area of Arizona to investigate the disappearance and the supposed murder of a pregnant woman. This premise is actually just delivered as text before the game begins, because I guess that's easier than writing in any kind of dialogue or creating some kind of cinematic to portray these basic elements of the plot. Anyway, in the opening, your helicopter crash lands, Lynn and Blake are separated, and you're soon introduced to two cults that populate the area who serve as the villains and enemies for the game. The first is a bunch of, I guess, pagans, and the others are an extremist religious group led by a guy named Sullivan Knoth, who's really the closest we get to an actual antagonist. Though I think I'll up you see maybe twice in the entire game. I don't want to say too much about the plot overall, but I will say there's going to be some minor spoilers in the video, though nothing major. Initially, your goal is just to reunite with Lynn, but from there things take a turn into absolute crazy town, quite literally, as you just move through one environment after the other. Caves, mines, forests, and churches. Lots of churches. All the while avoiding enemies in between these bizarre, often jarring flashbacks to Blake exploring some kind of school which tries to fill in the game's backstory. I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that these flashbacks take up probably close to 30% of the entire game. Then there's about 35% gameplay where you're sneaking around, hiding in tall grass and avoiding enemies, and maybe another 35% of scripted chase sequences. The problem is that none of these elements are really refined or all that honed. Now, the flashbacks are filler in every sense of the word, often requiring you just to move around the same looking classrooms and corridors over and over, trying each and every door you come across to progress on to the next scripted sequence that the game has in store for you. Piece by piece, you'll slowly put together these clues surrounding an event that occurred when Blake was a child, but it seems a little bit out of place and kind of juxtaposed with the events unfolding in the present, and I often found myself confused as to how it all tied in together. Back in the real world, you'll mostly be sneaking around and avoiding enemies, which is a really sloppily thrown together aspect of the game. Like the first Outlast game, your camera is really a most important tool, and it allows you to see in darkened areas and also use a microphone to try and gauge the location of nearby enemies. Every now and then you'll come up against a tougher enemy that can kill you really easily, and you'll really have to try to avoid them. A recent similar comparison to this is the Baker family in Resident Evil 7, but most of the time you're just up against other people armed with machetes or other sharp pointy things. There's patches of tall grass spread throughout the environment during these sections which hide the player to some extent, and if you're chased you can always bolt a door and hide under a bed or inside a cupboard. Despite being in almost pitch black throughout the entire game, this doesn't, as far as I could tell, have all that much of an effect on whether or not an enemy can see you. I mean, you can be standing in total darkness and yet these middle-aged rednecks are somehow able to see you. It makes no sense. On that note, this is a dark game, but not in the sense of it being atmospherically dark, more in the sense of there just not being enough light sources. Now look, I get they were going for this on purpose to make the game well dark and gloomy, but it's kind of obfuscating your vision to the extent that you can barely see where you're going. And I don't think that's really the effect they were going for. It at least runs pretty smoothly, I guess. It runs on the Unreal 3 engine, and like the first game, Red Barrels have really put this engine to the test, and there's certain areas that look pretty damn impressive. It also runs really smoothly as well, which is a nice change for a PC port. Unfortunately, they've ruined it a lot of the time with the abundance of visual effects they've tried to cram into the presentation. Honestly, I think this game has to win some kind of award for the most visually cluttering effects ever used in a video game. There's just countless times where it is impossible to see what's happening. It could be depth of field, it could be motion blur, or just messing around with the image to portray Blake's nausea or some other kind of injury. An early cinematic in the game has Blake attacked by a bunch of pagans, and just look at it yourself and tell me you can make out what the hell's supposed to be going on. Whenever you duck underwater to avoid detection from enemies, one of the game's oh-so-deep stealth mechanics, your sight becomes a literal blur, which I guess is realistic, but not entirely all that useful. as you can't even make out whether or not the enemy you're submerged to avoid in the first place is still going to be looking at you. The camera flicker during the flashbacks, for instance, became so bad it started to give me a headache. Once you've stumbled through one of these horribly thrown together stealth sections, you're then often required to simply run away from a bunch of enemies before they can catch you. The last few hours of the game are almost entirely comprised of these moments, and if you make a single wrong step or can't find the exact spot the game wants you to go next, well, you get killed pretty damn quickly. These chase sequences are also pretty much down to trial and error, which removes a lot of the skill out of it as well. The paths you're supposed to take aren't exactly highlighted all that brilliantly, and it really is a matter of a simple mistake, meaning a checkpoint restart. Hope you like running down the same tunnels and staircases 5 or so times until you learn the right route. Blake is also a horribly unfit asshole. He can run for about 5 or 10 seconds before he seems to lose his breath and can barely move, which makes some of the chase sequences incredibly unfair and unfun. I mean, in a game where literally your only defense is to run away, adding in this kind of a stamina system is just stupid. At certain times too, you'll notice the basic controls won't work either, and he won't even grab onto something crucial to your survival like a ledge you're desperately trying to reach. There's the expected quick time events too, where an enemy will latch onto you and you've got to complete a quick button prompt before they can kill you, and some of these are just outright broken, like they don't even work at all. And Outlast 2 is just full of these bizarre design choices, but even across the board, it's just got so much weird and stupid shit that I was often just sitting there stunned they'd included it in a video game. What I'm most surprised about is that this game didn't even get banned in Australia. For starters, how about the fact that Blake has to change his camera batteries every 60 seconds or else they go dead? Now look, I know this was done for balancing reasons, but even still, it drains out far too quickly, and I think if the batteries drained this quickly in real life, the digital camera market would be utterly sunk. You pick up batteries often enough on the normal difficulty that it's not that much of an issue, but you know, how about reduce the amount of batteries you come across but increase their charge time? I mean, that would at least make finding them a lot more of a relief. One section later in the game has you moving down a river on a crappy wooden raft, and this thing just goes on and on. It feels like you're crawling down this river, and it's not fun in the slightest. There's other design choices that just outright irk me as well. There's one area where you're walking across a bridge and if you fall off it, you die, which makes sense. And yet you're halfway across the bridge and fall off it anyway, but don't end up dying because it's what the game had planned. And it's the kind of thing that highlights the problems with these heavily scripted games. I think what I hate the most of these kind of games that let you play as an able-bodied person, and yet for some reason your character refuses to find a way to defend themselves. Like, there's no reason for Blake to not pick up any kind of stick, rock, or whatever he can get his hands on to try to defend himself. It at least makes sense that you can't fight back against some of the special, bigger and tougher enemies, but against an old lady with a machete, you'd better believe, Sonny Jim, that if that was me in real life, I'd knock that old bitch out without a second thought. Likewise, when he performs certain actions in the game, often when under duress, he moves as if he's doing fucking Tai Chi or something. You know the kind of moment when you're like pulling a door open or trying to move a crate to climb out of a room before someone catches you? Yeah, those types of moments, and Blake performs them like he hasn't got a goddamn care in the world. Now, in the game's defense, you might hear people talking about how dark and gritty and mature the story is, and truth be told, it is probably its one saving grace, as it is ambiguous enough that it can keep you somewhat invested, even if the whole psycho-religious cult and weirdo pagan thing has been done to death, but I found it just relied far too much on shock value for my liking. The ending for this game is some of the most messed up shit I've ever seen in a video game. Without spoiling anything, it delves into themes like rape, murder, and religion, but a lot of it feels like it's in bad taste. I mean, you can still make a repulsive horror story without covering some of the stuff these guys cover. Overall, though, I didn't really find Outlast 2 all that scary on the whole, because I was often far too irritated with the gameplay to find myself enjoying the atmosphere the game was trying to create. And likewise with the story, I found myself again disconnected for similar reasons. On a positive note, at least Outlast 2 won't really function all that well as YouTuber bait because there's only maybe half a dozen jump scares in the entire game. Most of the time it relies on the atmosphere and the environment to create a mood, which it pulls off for the most part. All up, I finished the whole thing in around 6 hours on the normal difficulty setting, and I have no intention to ever go back and replay it.
God hates vanity. So do I.
Outlast 2 is like that dumb, stupid horror movie that you go to see with your friends on the weekend. Paranormal Activity 7, The Conjuring 4, Saw 8, or whatever the hell happens to be out. You jump out of your seat a couple times, you leave the theatre and talk about it with your friend for 5 minutes, and yet by the time you're at the pub drinking your first beer and ordering a rump steak, you've almost forgotten entirely about it. And that's how I feel about Outlast 2. It's not a particularly amazing horror game, it's not particularly great at stealth, and it doesn't tell a particularly good story either. But it feels like it was at least thrown together by people who can manage to tie their own shoelaces. So if you're after just a brainless game to play until the next big thing comes along, then maybe it's worth checking out.